George, thank you very much for being a guest today.
Hello, yes.
So, I always start with my introductory questionnaire. What is your favorite word?
Crepuscular.
Nice. That's a previous guest's favorite word as well.
Oh, there we are. Great minds.
What is your favorite swear word?
Oh, um, bugger, if that
Nice.
counts.
What is a piece of advice you often give?
I don't know. That's a good question. Um, don't worry what other people think.
What's the best piece of advice you've received?
Don't go into academia.
What turns you on creatively or intellectually?
English political history.
What turns you off?
Continental philosophy and post-structuralism.
What is a book that changed your life?
That's a good question. Um, Quite a lot of books have changed my life, I suppose. But The Great Transformation by Polanyi, maybe.
What's a book you wish you had read already?
What I haven't read.
Yeah.
Oh God, that's a long list. I mean, this is incredibly. There are loads of the Against Heresies by Irenaeus comes to mind, but more practical on a very more trivial level. I have recently been sent a history of snooker, which I'm quite keen on reading.
And then finally, are there any fictional characters who you would like to imagine yourself being?
Um, that's a good question. Fictional characters I would like to imagine myself being. Perhaps Archdeacon Grantley from Barchester Towers.
Why?
Because he has sound church politics, and I identify with his maybe slightly over the top grumpy persona.
So the Raging Party is about the birth of the Whigs and the Tories in sort of late 17th and early 18th century Britain. Just so I begin, if you could give an overview of the period in the book.
Yeah, so this book looks at the period essentially between the late reign of Charles II, the Merry Monarch, who most people are probably familiar with, through to the Hanoverian accession. So that's when a family of Germans, the Hanoverians, become our royal family. And it covers a very tumultuous period of politics where essentially the first system of party politics between Whig and Tory opens up. There's a period essentially where Britain is sort of teetering on the cusp of modernity, and it's a period which sees this very, very tumultuous partisan battle create the context for and often influence things like the establishment of the Bank of England, the related rise of the national debt, the Act of Union between England and Scotland, which is obviously very important, and a whole tumultuous battle over war and peace in Europe and the fight against Louis XIV, the sort of Roman Catholic superpower. So it looks at, and this is, I would argue, in many ways the sort of after business, or the sort of finishing the business of the 17th century in terms of the English Civil War and then the Glorious Revolutions. One aspect of it is religious. In many ways, this is a battle within English Protestantism between high churchmen who are more Catholic with a small c, and who are more interested and who believe that society is a sort of organic body in which monarchy and the bishops sort of mutually support each other, and the dissenters who are the more radical, overtly Protestants, and that's sort of like the Puritans versus the Church. But there's also battles over the nature of the monarchy and the sort of country Britain wants to be. So, does Britain want to be, much as it was before, a sort of a predominantly agrarian society in which the squire and the parson, and indeed the bishops, hold a great deal of authority, and which is fairly insular, doesn't really get very involved in the affairs of Europe, or are we going to become a more financially sophisticated country that is much more involved in the affairs of the rest of the world, in Europe, gaining colonies abroad? And broadly speaking, the more sort of insular agrarian church and king vision is that of the Tories, and the sort of more cosmopolitan, outward-looking, pro-financial innovation sort of perspective is that of the Whigs, and that battle more or less resolves itself at the end of the period that my book covers.
So I was so glad when I saw your book on like a shelf in Waterstones, because I've always been interested in this period and sort of figures like Robert Harley. Uh, and it seems like there seems to be a growing popularity in this period. Sort of films like The Favourite and stuff like that.
I think the 17th century is having something of a vogue. There's been a lot of good books recently about the Civil War and the period around then. But I think, generally speaking, this period, which is basically the reigns of James II, William III, and Queen Anne, has for a long time been neglected and has been sort of... I mean, I'm not aware of anyone much who learnt about it at school. I think it's usually seen as too complicated and too sort of in the weeds for people to be concerned about. So most of the attention it has got in recent decades has been largely through that film about Queen Anne and the book that it was based on, The Favourite, and the sort of personal stuff about Queen Anne. And Queen Anne's quite an interesting character, a very tragic figure, has a pretty terrible life in many ways, and her relationship with Sarah Churchill, who is a sort of part confidant, part relentless bully. But I think, generally speaking, it's seen as just a bit too complicated. Most of the English history sort of teaching in schools and stuff goes right, sort of Tudor, Stuart, Civil War, maybe the Glorious Revolution to some extent, and then generic stuff about the Georgians and the Regency period, and then through to the Victorians, and then that's about it. But this is the period, when Britain emerges as a modern state, with an efficient tax collection system, the means to raise a major debt, and it's also the period where our religious sort of problems and divisions that have roiled us throughout the 16th and 17th century are pretty much settled, at least for quite a long time. And so it's quite important. If you want to understand the entire context for like the British Empire, sort of high Victorianism, and so on, this is where it's all sort of set up. I think generally speaking, people don't really focus on it, which I find bizarre, because also, as well as it being an important era, it's also, politics in this era, the 18th century, is a rambunctious, often violent, often entertaining game where there's a lot of very highly coloured and eccentric characters who, let's just put it this way, if you think contemporary politicians are bland or boring, this is very much not the case in this era, where you have almost everyone seems to be either a sort of an alcoholic or a rake, or got mistresses everywhere, or scheming, wily political mastermind. So I think it's a great period, and it's a great story, because it ends up with this sort of very dramatic climax whereby like the entire thing hinges on the life of Queen Anne, and there's a sort of last minute sort of desperate political fight behind the scenes to sort of determine the fate of the country. And there's a lot of people think that there's going to be potentially a civil war or an attempt to restore the Jacobites, which are the sort of older Stuart Roman Catholic line that have lost the throne in the Glorious Revolution. So I think it's a great period, an important one, but also just an entertaining one. Like, it's full of... I said to some people, it's like half a cross between sort of, a work of serious 17th century, 18th century political history and the sort of Jilly Cooper novel. Because there's a lot of horses, drinking, sex, so on.
Well, I've kind of had this idea of, like, for a culture that loves Game of Thrones, House of Cards, actually this whole period is ripe for... People probably won't find it too complicated, the various machinations. If they can follow Game of Thrones and House of Cards, they can probably follow the machinations of, Harley and Godolphin and Wharton.
Yeah, no, but it certainly there's an awful lot of people betraying each other, stabbing each other in the back, and sort of desperate last gasp parliamentary attempts to stave off this or the other, or a lot of sort of corruption, personal stuff. Is incredibly important. I think it's very we've got to bear in mind that this is an era where essentially the role of the monarch is still very important. I mean, people think the Glorious Revolution establishes sort of sometimes people would say parliamentary democracy. I mean, it establishes nothing of the kind. This democracy is still a very long way off. The monarch remains very important, and the decline of the power of the monarch is a very gradual process throughout the 18th and early 19th century. And certainly in the era of William III and Queen Anne, the monarch still has a huge amount of power and essentially appoints ministers to rule their government as the head of government. And now, Parliament is important. It's become increasingly important. You can't really rule without the support of particularly the Commons, but also the Lords. However, it's still a personal business. So, for example, Queen Anne spends an awful lot of time trying to avoid appointing ministers who she personally dislikes or she thinks are atheists or rakes or immoral sort of characters. The sort of most important political, in so many ways, the most important political relationship of the whole period is that between Queen Anne and Robert Harley, who is her sort of chief political manager, who's always trying to stave off her being bullied by the two main political parties, who are always trying to force her to do, to what is called force the chamber. So essentially force a one-party government and force the Queen to accede to the wishes of the two political parties. And Harley is always basically, although he generally works with the Tories more than the Whigs, Harley is essentially trying to manage, divide and rule and manipulate things such that the Queen can get through her agenda and not be sort of dictated to by the party magnates, but she trusts Harley, and right up until the end when they have a bit of a falling out, which is one of the more dramatic incidents in the book. But for many years, she trusts Harley, partly because Harley does what she wants politically, but also partly because Harley is a good family man, doesn't have any mistresses, is a good Christian, pious, and so on. Whereas she hates a lot of the chief Whigs, Wharton being the most obvious example, but also the Earl of Sunderland and various other people. She hates them, and she's desperate to avoid them getting into government and being her ministers. Often she's, in vain, but sometimes in vain, because she sees them as being personally dissolute, impious, not good churchmen, and so on. So I think that personal element of it, there's always a personal element in politics, right? I mean, even in this era, just think of the relationship between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, to take a particularly obvious example. There's always an element of the personal relationships, having a huge influence on the course of the nation and the whole political affairs. And I think we like to think that's not the case, because it seems a bit, because people like to think that we're more rational and sort of grown up, and that it should all be about policies and stuff. But let's be honest, a lot of politics is driven by emotion, it's driven by personal relationships and friendships, and that's not necessarily always a bad thing, I don't think. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this, is why when the personal betrayals come in this book, where a lot of people fall out, stab each other in the back, I mean, the book ends essentially with two of the leading figures in the government who are sort of basically Tories. I mean, Harley, by this point, has become more or less a Tory, although he's always intriguing with the Whigs behind closed doors. But they fall out. The two leading ministers in the government fall out really quite dramatically, and they're fighting this very personal battle, and it determines the fate of the government in many ways. And I don't think we've moved past that as much as we necessarily think we have. We're not, as sort of rational and bureaucratic as we think we are. And one of the points I would make about this is, I think that this is a period where the most important things to bear in mind about this is the big difference from politics as it stands now is most governments are not single-party governments. Most governments probably lean more towards one party or the other. It's not the case that a party gets a majority, you appoint the leader of that party as basically the Prime Minister. That's not how it works. In this period, it's a much more of a balancing game, whereby the Queen and the two parties in Parliament are constantly sort of playing sort of musical chairs with each other, and the Queen is trying to divide and rule the parties. Even if a party does have a majority, it's so divided. So the Tories particularly are always divided in this period. They argue about everything, chiefly the church, but also all sorts of questions of foreign policy and the question of the succession to the throne, all sorts of things. So managing Parliament is really hard in this era. It's like, the managers like Harley and Godolphin are always having to manage endless factions, balance them off against each other, sort of usually bribe or sort of play them off against each other, or give them patronage to sort of shut them up or whatever. And I think that in British politics, contemporary British politics, we're used to we've been for a long time used to a system whereby a strongish leader, Prime Minister, has a big majority, like Thatcher or Blair or whoever.
I imagine one of the problems we're getting to grip of this period is that there's lots of things that we would recognise now, but they're also not quite the things that we have now. So, there's the Whig bloc and there's the Tory bloc, but they're just not homogenous blocks. There's like huge variation within them.
Yeah.
And you have moderates on each side that someone like Godolphin tries to balance. So that's one thing people have to try and get their heads around.
Yeah, so, I mean, They definitely are political. These are political parties in a meaningful sense, I think, because they often have, reason on issues which are particularly party political issues, which are often particularly things that have to do with religion. You can see that people vote quite consistently with one party. I mean, if you look at the division lists, there is quite a lot of regularity. So it's clear that it's meaningful to talk about two, Whig and Tory. However, they're not political parties in the modern sense. First of all, most of the people sitting in Parliament are, particularly whether it's the Commons, and you have to bear in mind the Lords is a very important chamber in these days. There is no primacy of the Commons. You have to get things through the Lords as well, except in financial matters where the Commons does have primacy. But in most things, you have to get through both. So the parliamentarians who are either squires, big landowners, or they are sort of aristocrats, members of the House of Lords, and these people have big interests and local power over the various constituencies. So a lot of the electoral politics is often defined by battles between local elites who are using their power, the property they own, the patronage they have, the people that they employ a lot of people, and what you call their interest in a constituency. So there are whips in this era, but they are much weaker because there's no sense, because the individual players are so much more powerful in their own right. They're not reliant on the party machine to get elected in many cases. The parties are a coalition of people in Parliament united by a shared view on a number of particular issues. But it's not like nowadays where if a party withdraws the whip from an MP, that they're basically and says you can't be the Labour or the Conservative or whatever candidate next election, then that means you're going to lose your seat. You are reliant on the party. The reason why you've been elected is because you have the party logo next to your name on the ballot paper. That's not the case in this period at all. That whatever electoral magnate we may be talking about, whether it's Sir Edmund Seymour, who is the sort of electoral king of the West Country for the Tories, or Wharton, who is this massive parliamentary power broker and has huge electoral influence over the country. So the tail wags the dog. Really, there isn't the discipline of a modern political party, and it's not as professionalised. However, as you said at the start, what's really striking about it is how it's recognisable to modernise in some ways, but it's just a bit different. It's a mixture of recognisably similar, but sufficiently different to be odd and alien. But I think the basic process is you can see that this is modernity is sort of hoving into view, and the things that are familiar to us are gradually sort of emerging and becoming more prominent. So, for example, this is an era where quite sophisticated electoral campaigning organisations are set up, because there's quite a substantial electorate. It varies. It's a patchwork of different franchises. But some seats, and not an inconsiderable number of seats, have a fair number of voters, thousands of voters, and often quite lower down the social scale. In some constituencies, there's a couple of constituencies that have all male householders. 50% of the population have the vote in some seats. So that's not a million miles away from a modern democratic election. And so they appoint agents, they handwrite letters to send out and print handbills, which are basically leaflets and stuff. And this Tory canvasser has basically his canvas returns. So he knocks on the doors, and then in one place, somebody says, we don't vote for you round here. We're all low church Whig men around here. You needn't bother in this village. I have been involved in electoral politics for my sins in the past, and I thought that sounds like I've heard. Obviously with slightly different party names and stuff, but I've heard exactly that. People say that to me when I was knocking on doors. And as I said, the electorate is surprisingly large. The overall electorate is probably 25% of men in the country. Which is not nothing, and it does mean that politicians, probably for the first time in this era, have to pay attention to something called public opinion in a way that they hadn't really ever had to. Previously, elections were such an elite consensus. Basically, the gentry of the county or whatever will gather together and decide, and occasionally there might be a personal falling out, and then there'd be a contested election. But a lot of the time there were no contested elections, But the emergence of party politics in this era, where the elite is fractured, almost everywhere, the elite, the gentry, the aristocrats, the landowners, they become brittly divided, and this opens up a fissure whereby they can't just rely on sort of elite consensus and he's a jolly good chap, so he can be the county MP again, whatever. And this means that public opinion has to be factored in. because the electorate's been growing through a lot of the 17th century for various reasons to do with inflation eroding the value of the property qualification, which means that it's a lower and lower bar, and various other reasons to do with the intricacies of the electoral system. The electorate has been growing. And the other thing is, in the mid-1690s, pre-publication censorship of newspapers and pamphlets and so on ceases. This means there's a massive increase in the number of newspapers, pamphlets, handbills, all sorts of literature flooding onto the market, and they are appealing and trying to shape public opinion. This is a qualitatively new phenomenon. Public opinion, electoral politics is starting to become a major shaper of the fate of the nation in a way which, not entirely, as I said, but as you said, that it's still a bit strange and a bit weird, and the elite figures, landowners, do have more power than we would be. It's not democratic, but some of the key features that we now take for granted are starting to emerge in a really important way, and I think that's what makes it particularly interesting.
I mean, what struck me reading the particular chapter where you go into how elections and the electoral system worked was that, well, they're not quite the same. It kind of reminded me of, I guess, US politics. Everything from sort of the amount of money that would be spent, the gerrymandering, the way you would have authorities from one party interfering to make it harder for other party voters. So that was my way into understanding it. If you can kind of imagine an American election, it's kind of like that.
It's sort of like American politics at its worst and it's sort of most grubby, and they do all sorts of things. Everything about the poll can be manipulated in some way by the returning officer, and the returning officer is usually either the mayor of the corporation, if it's a borough, or the Lord Lieutenant of the county, if it's a county election, and they are almost always party figures. So they manipulate things in any way they can. And one sort of very good example is they can change where the poll takes place. In a county election, where some elections are basically all of the county that doesn't have a borough, there are huge distances, like you could, and if you put the poll like far up in northeast Yorkshire or somewhere, or wherever you know that your party has its support, has a concentration of support, and you know that the Whig vote is on the southeast or the whatever of the or the southwest of the county or something, then they'll just a few days before the election they'll just move the place at the poll to make it very hard for the other party to get their supporters to vote. And then, I mean, there's a particularly famous example where in Hampshire they move the poll to the Isle of Wight, so that you have to get on a boat and literally sail to cast your vote in order to, and the parties sometimes come up with other innovative ways around this. I mean, a lot of organising people to get to the poll, transport becomes actually quite important. So there's one occasion in which the Tories hire a fleet of barges to carry their voters up the Thames in order to get to where the polling station is. And there's also like constant attempts to challenge the validity of voters at the poll. Elections in this era are a public thing. They're not. There's no secret about it. But you have to go up into the polling place, which is usually at the town hall or whatever, and say to the returning officer, "I want to cast my votes for whoever," out loud, and which has several consequences. One is if your employer or landlord is a Whig and you cast your vote for the Tory candidates, they might evict you or sack you. Or if they don't, if a mob outside who doesn't like what you have to say, they might beat you to a pulp. It makes the whole thing a bit more high stakes. But it also means that there's an awful lot of, in order to do this, you have to be registered as a qualified voter. So you have to go and consult with the person who runs the poll book, and they say, "Oh yes, you meet the qualification," which are all different in every constituency. So this gives rise to endless, like the Tory agent will try and challenge their credentials to vote and say, "Oh, well, you don't meet the threshold." And there's like lawyers at the poll arguing the toss about whether, which I mean, it sounds very much like a lot of modern American politics where there's constant wrangles to say, to show that people don't have the right to vote, or they're voting they've been sent to the wrong polling station or whatever. So yeah, it's a brutal, it's a much more brutal process. Part of the reason for this, I think, is because as this is where party politics is emerging, there's a great paradox at the heart of it, which is that neither side really accepts that parties are legitimate, even though they are massive party politicians themselves. Because the mindset of British politics before this was that politics was a consensus, an elite consensus, basically. And so they both think that the other side disagreeing is not legitimate opposition. Like we now think, the leader of Her Majesty's opposition, and we have this culture which grew up in the 18th century of thinking it's legitimate to have an official opposition, and political parties disagree with each other. Although we've now got increasingly bitter about our politics, nonetheless we still basically have that view. But as party politics is starting, that's not really the view people have. That they don't really see the other side as legitimate. They see that the Tories see the Whigs as sort of like radical, schismatic, king-killing Republicans who are illegitimate, and the Whigs see the Tories as sort of sclerotic, authoritarian, crypto-papists who want to sell the country to France. They really hate each other, and they don't really see the other side as legitimate. There's no real concept of a loyal opposition. If you're in power, you see the opposition. I mean, this is why the politics is so brutal. When you lose power in this era, it's not like, you shake hands, good, jolly good show, chaps, good luck with government, like it is, even now in British politics. If you lose the power and the other and the government is then dominated by Whigs or whatever, they will turn around and try and impeach you, usually. And in an impeachment, which is another similarity to American politics, right? Impeachment fell out of use in British politics in the late 18th century, but in this period it's still very much a central part of politics. So you will basically try your opponents for crimes, treason, or whatever, and the consequence of being impeached as a politician who's recently lost office can be death. Or at the least a good stretch in the Tower of London. I mean, this just is the period where that's starting to lose some of its edge, and most of the politicians of this era are starting to. They often get sent to the Tower of London for a bit, but they're just starting to not be executed. But the threat of that still hangs over things. So towards the end of my book, there's a big fight over a peace. So basically, the Tories want peace with France, and the Whigs don't, and the Whigs basically think that the reason the Tories want peace is because the Tories are preparing to restore the Stuart family and who are Roman Catholics. They see the Tories as plotting a sort of treasonable attempt to prevent a Protestant royal succession, which is not really true, but that's how they see it. And when they're having a debate on the peace in the House of Lords, where a lot of the most important debates in this era take place because a lot of the most senior politicians are in the Lords, Robert Harley is outlining the peace preliminaries, the basic terms on which the peace will be negotiated. And the Whig Junto Lords, who are sort of the leaders of the Whig Party, are like doing cutthroat gestures to him over the dispatch box, which is basically like you are committing treason, and when you lose power, we will execute you. So it's quite a high stakes game, which is why it's so bitter. And I think the danger of modern politics maybe is that we're starting to move a little bit back towards that idea. I think it's certainly American politics. The idea that the other side are, loyal sort of opposition who are you disagree with, but fundamentally, you think they have a right to exist and have a legitimate opinion, and you have peaceful transfer of government between. Clearly, in American politics, that's not looking quite as obvious as it used to. The Democrats and the Republicans hate each other. And see each other as illegitimate, I think, in a way which is quite similar to the way that the early Whigs and Tories saw each other, which I don't think is a healthy development for American politics, to be honest.
Another similarity I thought with America was I love the story about the Whigs and the Tories basically choosing an opera singer each to sort of stan, and them sort of creating a false feud between these two opera singers. It kind of reminded me of the way sort of Taylor Swift or Sydney Sweeney have suddenly become mascots that they haven't really put themselves in. They've just been taken up.
Yeah, I mean, because the political matter is so all-encompassing, and it is really a culture war, that no area of life is seen as off-limits, right, for political partisanship. So, which doctor you hire to treat you, or, and this is an age where astrology is still quite big thing, which astrological almanac you read, or which astrology you consult, or anything can be seen as ladies at the theatre or at the opera where they wear their beauty spots on their face is seen as an indicator of whether you're a Whig or a Tory. And basically opera this is a period in where Italian opera is starting to become a big thing, and having not previously been significant in English culture. And the Whigs have essentially tried to imply that Italian opera is sort of crypto-papist, Tory, absolutist innovation, which should be abhorred by all good Englishmen who want honest English opera. And they select us, and the two opera singers, an Italian opera singer and an English opera singer, who they sort of get adopted by both sides as like sort of talismans or sort of figureheads for the two parties. I actually don't think that the two. I don't think they're very interested in politics, particularly at all, to be honest. But they become like in an age where everyone's sort of paranoid about politics because it's so all-encompassing, everyone's like, "Wow, is this opera singer?" You know, and I think you're right. You know, it's like in American cultural politics at the moment, like every big figure who's a pop star or whatever, or a film actress or whatever, everyone has to project their politics onto them, and it's almost impossible for these people. I don't really know much about, but Sydney Sweeney seems to not, just doesn't want to be drawn on it. I mean, I don't think she really wants to say one way or the other, which I think is fair enough. But she can't help it. She's been drawn into this sort of cultural war between the Trump and the Democrats, whether she likes it or not. And it's a sign that when politics gets too, all or nothing, and there's a lack, and partisanship becomes a sort of existential matter. Not just of like who will run the country, but like if we lose, we're dead. And a sort of existential like war to the finish, war to the to the bitter end. It tends to infect everything, and like everyone gets drawn into even figures and cultural elements that you would think would be maybe free from it, like the theatre, the opera, horse racing, almost every form of entertainment in Queen Anne's England gets at some point dragged into the party political battle. And I should imagine it was quite exhausting at the time, and just as it's exhausting for Americans at the moment to have, nothing, there's nothing that isn't politicised and brought into this culture war, which I think is probably not a good thing, really.
One reason why I've always been interested in this period is that there are quite significant political figures like Harley, like Godolphin, who've just kind of been forgotten by a lot of even very politically engaged people. There's Charles II, and then there's basically a jump to Walpole, and then you get Pitt the Elder, Pitt the Younger, and then it goes on from there. But actually, there are these very significant figures who are very politically adept, who passed very significant legislation. They fought and negotiated the end of very important wars. So I'm kind of curious about for people like Keir Starmer, for people like Kemi Badenoch, what do you think are some lessons learned from, say, a Harley, the Junto Lords, or Godolphin?
Well, one lesson which I think is probably a perennial in politics, really, but is illustrated particularly sharply by this era, is unity is everything. The dynamic in this period is basically, I'm slightly generalising, but this is broadly true. In the country, the Tories are the more popular party. Most elections end up with the Tories having more MPs, and they win several massive landslides, whereas the Whigs are not as popular in the country, generally speaking. However, despite this, the period is basically a period where the Whigs are surprisingly strong and essentially mostly more than hold their own, despite often having fewer MPs and being a weaker party. Why is that? Well, it's because the Whigs are always... Okay, the Whigs do have their problems. They're not always completely united, but they're a lot more united than the Tories. The Tories are always falling out. They're always scrapping with each other. They often hate each other more. They have a leadership which is always completely divided. There are 3 or 4 sort of leaders who are always contradicting each other or falling out, or they hate each other or whatever. Whereas the Whigs, basically, particularly from the sort of the late 1690s onwards, where they become a smaller party because some of their supporters peel away, and because they're unhappy with the fact that the Whigs have sort of become the party of high taxes, war, support for the monarchy, because they want to win this war with France. But a smaller party, they become a sort of smaller party with a less support to an extent, but a much more united party that basically has its eyes relentlessly on their message, which is the Tories are Jacobites who will sell you out to the French. They're crypto-papists. We have to win the war with France in order to stop the Stuarts being put back on the throne and imposing papism on us all. They hammer the same message home again and again and again. Whereas the Tories are all over the place, and the Tories are always going too far and just overplaying their hand and not realising the weakness in some ways of their own position, and being very presumptuous and sort of running ahead of where the support of either the monarch or Commons or whatever are, and losing sight of that. So that's, I think, one massively important issue. And the other important issue, which I think is particularly one that I think maybe Keir Starmer could do with realising, is that the genius of this period, I think, really is Harley. I mean, the Whigs are very impressive. The Junto, who are the lords that lead the Whig party, are very impressive, largely because they're domineering, they give very strong leadership, and they impose far more discipline through bold, through pretty bold putting pressure on people. But Harley is the only match they really have. And he achieves remarkable success, considering that he's often trying to marshal a bunch of completely ragtag bag of people who don't agree on very much, and so on. What Harley's political genius shows you, what Harley's political genius is essentially that he is the consummate, along with actually Walpole, becomes quite similar later on. I think in many ways that Walpole is sort of learning from or continuing the approach of Harley. Harley is the best informed man about everyone. He neglects no one, no matter how insignificant they seem. Like any old backbencher who he never forgets, and he has agents throughout the country who gather information. He has information. He knows this constituency, this MP wants this. There's a toll road through there that they need to pay for, or the silk industry is powerful in this constituency, and therefore this MP will always have to take account of their industry, or whatever. Harley's brilliantly informed. He knows what all the backbenchers want or think, or what jobs they're wrangling after, which a lot of this is the people who go after patronage, and therefore he can manipulate people, or he can, nobody knows more than Harley. Nobody knows more about the detail, and he has a great command of parliamentary procedure as well. So he can load bills with amendments to make them unacceptable, or make a bill sort of political football between the Lords and the Commons, which means eventually it falls. And my impression of, and it's not just Keir Starmer, it's many prime ministers of recent times, is that they turn up to Parliament and often they completely ignore their own backbenchers, or they have sort of a mixture of complete indifference or contempt towards their own backbenchers. Keir Starmer seems to turn up like once every, very occasional, votes about twice a parliamentary session, and doesn't seem to really have any feel for, and I get that being a prime minister is quite a full-on occupation, but in this era, in an era where Parliament really mattered, where the parties were much more divided and stuff, you had to have, know what your backbenchers were thinking, listen to them, go and talk to them. Now, Harley had some weaknesses as well, like he would often promise the same job to 3 different people, and make mistakes because he was under such enormous pressure. And the forces ranged against him were so enormous. It's amazing that he managed to achieve the things. He achieves a major peace deal in Europe, which really settles the affairs of Europe and brings peace for 20 years, and he does that with a huge range of forces ranged against him.
And last year I talked to Damien Collins about his book about Lloyd George, and he's another one who both used his circle to gather information on what people want, and then was also very good at leveraging personal relationships to get those things. And so I always put my head in my hands when sort of like I'll read, say, Stephen Bush say that Kemi Badenoch is a bit lazy and doesn't really keep up to date with briefs, or Keir Starmer doesn't like adjudicating departmental arguments between ministers and prefers to outsource it. I just kind of think that's not how you do this well.
No, I think, often when Harley slips up, sometimes it's because the Tories suspect that he's doing some sort of backhanded deal with the Whigs, not always untruthfully, but also it's when he loses touch, in the hurly-burly of things, and he's outbid by people. I think in politics, politics is it doesn't necessarily have to be a corrupt or morally a horrible business, but it's always a question of balancing interests and working out what people want, and giving it to them. that's what politics is always, to some extent. I mean, there are often lofty moral ideals as well, which is all well and good. And also having a clear idea of what the hell it is you're trying to do in the first place is usually a good idea. I mean, there's a problem, I think, with this, with Starmer's government, is they're just sort of reactive and they're sort of just floundering around, responding to things as they come up. It's not really clear what their really big goals are. Whereas, it's successful politics in the era of my book, when Harley comes in 1710, he knows that he has to achieve a peace, ideally on the best terms possible. That's the only thing that will keep the Tories together. And in fact, when the peace is achieved, the Tories start to fall apart because they don't agree on much else. And the Whigs are great at this. I mean, I think this is one of the great strengths of the Junto, is that they are always laser focused on whatever the objective is at the time, and link it into a wider political story. A narrative. So the narrative is usually, the Tories are trying to sell us out to the Jacobites and the French, which is not always true, but it certainly provides a narrative. And then they find any opportunity in Parliament to hammer this home, to find a set piece in Parliament to illustrate this point, or to sort of bring it home to people, or to bring it onto the agenda, and their objectives are always brutally clear. Like, there was any doubt what Wharton's aim is at any point. It's stop the peace at any means, and then it's to protect the Protestant succession by passing various attempts at various bits of legislation and so on. So whereas Starmer just comes in. I mean, it's obviously a very different context, but it nonetheless, he sort of comes in, drifts. It doesn't seem to know what. I mean, he clearly doesn't know what his own backbenchers. I'm not. This is not a party political comment. I mean, I'm just saying purely in terms of party, the political management. Like, he would seem to be surprised that his own backbenchers would be, terribly opposed to the mooted welfare reform. So this year, it's like, well, how? I mean, and apparently the whip, even though the whips were telling him that this was going to be a problem, it's like, well, you've either got to work out what you want to achieve, and then work out a way of achieving it. If you just contemptuously ignore your own backbenchers, or you don't give them any narrative, or you've got to, it's about projecting a message and a narrative, but also like being prepared to get down to the bare bones of like what will it take for you to pass this? What do I need to do? And that politics is not, it's always there's an element of that. I think the problem is that Starmer is sort of a technocratic lawyer who thinks that everything, is a sort of cut and dried question that could be addressed in a sort of very legalistic way. But that's not how politics is, and it never is. And I think, the era of my book illustrates that particularly clearly. But some of these things are perennials. I mean, the other thing, a lot of what I'm talking about was the key to the success of LBJ. If you've ever read the long biographies of LBJ by Caro, whatever his name is, the source of his success in the Senate in the 50s, and indeed when he's president, is exactly the same as the things that we're talking about with Harley or Wharton. He knows what everybody wants. He knows how to manipulate them. He knows how to. Sometimes you put pressure on people and bully them, but then sometimes that doesn't work, and sometimes you've got to give them a carrot. And it's all about working out what incentives people will respond to. And to do that, you need to work hard, be always politically have your antennae up, but also be prepared to cut deals. And it's messy, but that's politics. Like, you can't get away from it completely.
Finally, I was just going to ask: are there lessons to be learned for depolarizing contemporary politics from this period, or does it just require one side to win decisively?
Well, no. Well, I'll tell you that the period where that I would point to that may give an answer, or at least throw some light on that question, is actually the period just after this period. So the Whigs become basically completely dominant after 1714, and then after a bit of infighting for some years, eventually Robert Walpole emerges as the top dog and is Prime Minister for 20 years and has a pretty unparalleled. That's why he's seen as the first Prime Minister. He has a pretty unparalleled power over British politics. So now Walpole, partly, it's because there's a new king who is more favourable to the Whigs and doesn't really want the Tories in because he suspects that they're Jacobites and so on. But that's not the key. The whole story. Walpole knew that he had the support of the king, which was a very powerful thing in those days, and he knew he could rely on the king and the treasury to throw their resources behind his party at election time, which is basically sort of state state-sponsored corruption in order to win elections. Well, that is a big factor. Walpole was whatever one thinks of Walpole, whether one you like him or not, he was a very canny operator. And one of the key insights of Walpole was he knew that the Whigs were not necessarily very popular in the country. He knew that they had a political ascendancy because of various structural things, but he knew that there were certain things, an experience of the period that my book's about had shown him, there were certain things that could really rile people against the Whigs. One was the church. Well, now, there's a great... one of the most important instances in my book is a huge public outcry in favour of the church over the prosecution of a parson called Dr. Cheverel, which caused riots, and it creates a huge public sort of outcry against the Whigs, which is extraordinary in its scale. Like the popular pro-church sentiment, leads to the biggest Tory majority in a massive landslide. He realises if you touch the church, if you prod the church and just and undermine it, you're touching the third rail for a Whig of British politics. So, and the other thing he realises is people don't like war and taxes. The reason why one of the reasons why the Whigs are so unpopular in the period I'm writing about is because they were the war party, and then if you're the war party, you're the tax party because for obvious reasons you have to pay for the war. So Walpole realised that what people wanted, including the landed squires that made up a lot of Parliament, the people who sat in the Commons, they wanted peace, they wanted low taxes, and they wanted the church to be basically left alone. And those were the three things which gave the Tories their most popular, the three real things that underpinned the Tory support. So what did he do? Well, he kept, except right towards the end of his period, much to his own, against his better judgment, he basically didn't get involved in any wars. Britain's more or less at peace for 20 years. He brings taxes down. He brings the land tax, which is the main tax, which is relevant, down, and gradually to 1 shilling in the pound rather than 4. And he basically doesn't really do anything with the church. He just leaves it alone. Just doesn't, despite people in his own party who want to take more radical actions to undermine some of the privileges of the church, he just says, no, leave it. Just leave it. So he basically gives in to a lot of the things that the Tories the things that really riled the Tory part of the country. And as a result, though, party politics doesn't die out, and there is still opposition to Walpole, certainly. But fundamentally, he becomes incredibly secure, and a lot of the heat is taken out of the politics in that 20 years, because he's compromised. He could have tried to really rub the Tories' face in it because he had the power to do so, probably because of the support of the king. But he thought that his own premiership, his own power would be more secure if he made enough compromises to the other side to essentially. So your average Tory squire probably, although they sort of grumble a bit, and so by the mid-period of Walpole's prime ministership, most of the Tory squires are like, you know what, it's not that bad. I can't be bothered. Walpole is not, they don't like Walpole. They think he's a snake, and they think he's not very, they don't really like him, but they can't be. A lot of the heat is taken out of it, and they think, what, Walpole is sort of giving us a lot of what we want, therefore we'll quiet down. And so I think that's, ultimately, if you've got a culture war with massive problems of this kind, there's probably going to have to be some sort of settlement which is a compromise which both sides can live with. Although whether that's possible now is quite another question, which I can't answer probably, but I think that might give some pointers.
George, thank you very much.
Thank you.